Why do we do what we do? It's a question I think a lot of people have been asking as the world has turned upside down and everything has changed. What is essential? What is not? Should I really be doing this? Can I nip to the shop for the forgotten cooking ingredient, or should I improvise? Why can't we worship together? How can we worship together? Does it matter how we worship together? As a church leader, I've been involved in conversations about re-evaluating church with other ministers. Some ministers are at a loss without the thing that centres them on a Sunday. I think we all feel like that a bit. Some are relieved to not have to organise a service every week. Some, when news came out of Germany that churches could meet but not sing, expressed their joy, not in song of course, because they thought it might help people to focus on less singing focused worship. Some are really pleased that they can now focus on supporting and knowing their community, something we're continuing to do and have recognised as key to our church life for many years. There was no question that some of the work that we do would carry on. Some are raving about how there are now lots of little churches inside homes. I don't think that's true. I think the church has been scattered and we will gather again. Some are in hibernation because they just don't know what to do. What do you think? What matters in church life? What makes church church? What do you miss most? Why do you miss it? What are the things you've realised are most important? What's important for your faith? What will change when we meet together again? Not because it's imposed on us, but because our perspectives have changed. Will we value the community more? Will we value what we do in services more? Will we do these things differently? When we meet together again, what will our worship look like? What will we do if we can't sing? How do we socially distance in worship? What does our worship look like right now? It is very different to what it was 7 weeks ago. What are our priorities as we're evaluating all of this? Our first priority surely is God. Our first question when we think about how we worship and serve as a church should be, what do we offer to God in all of this? And we shouldn't let the other questions tangle ourselves up in knots, because if we're focusing on God, we've got to be doing something. We've got to be doing most things right, everything right even, because that's the first thing. As we move through Hebrews chapter 11, we pause for the story of Abel. His story is one of sacrificial worship. It says in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4, by faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. So we're at the story of Abel and his brother Cain, right from the beginning of the Bible. As we think about what it means to have and practice our faith in this time of crisis, this story challenges us on where our priorities lie. It shows us that worship was there right from the very beginning, and it matters to God how we come to worship. So I'm going to read from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 to 8. Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord I have brought forth a man. Later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of the time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favour on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favour. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. What is it about Cain and Abel? Why is Abel more faithful than Cain? Why does Cain get told off? And why is Abel lifted as an example of faith in Hebrews 11? And it's clear that Cain did something wrong here. He killed his brother. But there's a deeper message in there. It's the first lesson in the Bible about what it means to worship faithfully, what it means to worship with our priorities in the right place. If Abel's sacrifice was more faithful, let's look at what separated the two of them out. Some commentators and preachers focus on the fact that Abel's sacrifice was a blood sacrifice. It was an animal. Was it that made it more faithful? The focus when we go on to the laws in the Old Testament is that sacrifices using animals were better than those that did not. And often there's some thought in those kind of sermons around how Jesus shed blood and that's what made everything right, and so that must be the reason that Abel's sacrifice was better. I think they've got that a bit wrong though. I don't think that's the focus here. To focus on that right now diverts us from what is actually happening here and presents an image of God that is downright unfair. Because if you look at what Cain and Abel did, they had very different jobs, so they had different things to bring, and they couldn't just go to the shop and buy meat. They couldn't go to the temple and buy meat because there was no shop and no temple at that point. Abel worked with the animals, so his sacrifice was animal. Cain worked on the land, so his sacrifice was from the grains he was growing. What they had to give was different, and they both gave from what they'd worked for themselves. Giving in worship something that they have tended with their own hands. Surely that is good enough. Well, in Cain's case, it wasn't. Because despite them having the potential to give their best, he did not do that. Abel took the firstborn of his flock, the good portions. He was giving God his best. Cain just took some of his crop. Whatever was to hand, probably. They should have been able to give equal sacrifices, but Cain seemingly chose not to. So was it about the quality of the sacrifices then? Well, yes, I think that this does have something to do with it. But the thing is, we all get it wrong sometimes. We all come to worship with the wrong attitude sometimes. But it's about what we do with that. Maybe if Cain had realised his mistake, gone back with better, things might have been different. Cain had not recognised that coming in worship involved investing something of himself. He missed the costly element, so he didn't bring the best of the best. He didn't honour God with everything, he just honoured God with something. Abel offered all that he had. Cain did not do that. But there was more to it than that even. What they gave was important, quality was important, but they weren't to give their lasts. They were to give their first. But that then brings me on to the next point, the last question about the difference in the two of them. Perhaps it was something to do with who they were inside, who they had become as men. You probably know that often the Hebrew names of Old Testament characters mean something. Well, Cain means get. Abel means nothingness. A classic everything, nothing. Cain gets, Abel, nothing. Rich, poor, privileged, oppressed, divide. Representation that you often get in the Old Testament. If their names were anything to go by, Cain should get all the praise and Abel should not. Abel is kind of representative of those who get the short end of the stick. But actually in the story it's the other way round. Cain's privileged name is lived out in his reaction. He's going to get. He is get. So perhaps he's expecting to be more favoured, which might be the reason for his irrational envy, thinking Abel was more loved by God, perhaps. Perhaps he knew he hadn't given his all and expected Abel to fall short too. But then Abel didn't. Cain was like a consumer worshipper. He expected to give little but get lots in return. It's like when you go to church or you go to an online service and you say, I got nothing out of that, I'm not going back. That's the kind of worshipper Cain was. But we know that God doesn't call us to consume as worshippers. But as Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, he expects us to give our whole selves as a living sacrifice in worship. Give as much as we can to God. But Cain didn't get that. And whilst he could have, if he had wanted to, rectify his heart and put God first with what he offered to God, he couldn't then rectify what he went on to do next, because he brought the first death into the world. His expectations of God's love and justice were self-centred, unfaithful and untrusting. Cain only recognised the value in himself and not in Abel, so he took Abel's life. What's inside, what motivates us as we come to worship, it's important. When and how we come to worship mirrors where our faith priorities lie. Are they with God, or are they with being the minimum in the hope it is enough? Cain's personal responsibility in the quality and thinking behind his worship was important. It mattered that he took responsibility for the quality of his worship. How we approach God, even in this time of lockdown, importantly in this time of lockdown, it matters. What are we doing with our time? Are we putting Jesus first? Are we making worship a priority? As we question everything at the moment, then there are a few things I think we can learn from the story of Cain and Abel. Firstly, that worship was established from the very beginning. We need to be making time to worship in whatever form that takes. There's something really important for us as a church about gathering at the same time, going through the same service material. It shows that we are united in faith. We feel that the church that God has called us to it's important to still gather. It keeps us in the habit of meeting together. And that does take effort. It does take effort. Just as arriving at church for 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning, it takes effort. And sometimes that's really hard for some of us. Don't give up worshipping together, whatever that looks like, because it's easier not to. We have the tendency when we're stuck in at home to become a bit lazy with this. And actually, we need to be putting in effort into how we worship and how we worship as a church family, as a community together. The second thing this story tells us is that we all have the resources to do this. We all have the resources to worship, to come to God in worship. At this time when we're having to find new ways, I've been challenged by all this technology. I've been challenged by the change of how we meet. But I'm determined to use what I've been given to try and worship God, to try and lead others to worship God. That's all that God asked of Cain and Abel. Bring the best of what you have. This is what he asks of us as well. Bring the best of what you can to worship. Even if for some of us it is sitting reading a piece of paper alone, because we have nothing else. We bring the best of what we can, making the most of this situation that we find ourselves in. The third thing the story teaches us, and most importantly, is that living and worshipping faithfully is all about what's in our hearts. Abel came with the sole purpose to worship God. Cain came with all sorts of things going on. When we come to worship, we need to try and fix our eyes on God and show him how much we adore and love him. That's the start. If we can get that bit, we're getting somewhere. when we question why we do what we do, what we're going to do next, what's going to happen when lockdown is over, perhaps there are some questions that we need to ask ourselves. Firstly, are the things we're concerned about, do they matter to God? For Cain and Abel, their sacrifice, their worship mattered to God, and how they came to him mattered to him. Does the things that we're questioning, the things we're thinking about, do they matter to God? The second one is, does the question that we're asking come from a heart that is aligned in the right direction? Abel's did. Abel's heart was aligned in the right direction, which is why he's lifted up in Hebrews as a great man of faith. And the third thing I think we need to ask is does what we're thinking about, what we're questioning, build up, or does it tear apart? Cain's reaction tore apart. Our call is to Christ-centred community. And it takes effort to be committed to that right now. It really takes effort to be committed to the community that Christ has called us to. And it hurts at times. And there may be a temptation to not engage in worship alongside our brothers and sisters, not to talk to one another. It may take effort to feel like part of the church family, or to help others feel like part of the church family. It might be easier just to opt out, particularly when it's someone who is involved that we're not bothered about, or we don't like, or it's a topic we don't like, or there's something better somewhere else, something better on another channel, something better with whatever we're doing. But the thing is, God knows what we're doing. He knows what is on our hearts, and he calls us together to worship him. And that will take effort, but there will eventually be a reward. To be faithful in our priorities is to look to God first, to align our hearts in him, align our hearts to him in worship, and in the way we engage with and care for others, and be all he has called us to be, however difficult it is in our current circumstances. We need to be like Abel and not like Cain.